Hey folks, in this practice we're going to get into some of my favorite shoulder work to do that I feel like is really good prep for really any hand balancing or arm balancing work, along with any weight bearing stuff that you do on your hands. The shoulder girdle is an area of the body that we commonly don't necessarily use to its fullest capability, and in doing so we sometimes lose some of the resilience there. So I find that these practices that I'm going to guide you through here are resilience building practices for the glenohumeral joint specifically, and the muscles that support the glenohumeral joint being primarily the rotator cuff muscles. And then also we'll take a look at the scapular-costal movers, and we'll make sure that they're working the way that we want them to as well. And I find that this work again is really good preparation for further practice with weight-bearing activities. Even more so, more dynamic practices. This is a really good way to prepare the musculature to support you well throughout more dynamic practices. Okay? If you have a couple of books or blocks, bring them with you and we'll use them towards the beginning of this practice. To start with, we're going to be lying down on our front. So when you get down, bring your arms out to a T and have the elbows bent to about 90 degrees of flexion. Now if you find this position with your chest down, if you find this position to be a little too much, then you could place a bolster or a series of blankets underneath your torso, and so you would be building the floor up a little bit. Okay, so you can do that. If you feel like this position is already plenty, then I would build up the floor a little bit for your chest and torso. Once you then get set up, try to keep your elbows at 90 degrees throughout all of this work, okay? And then either with your chin or your forehead on the floor, just to make sure we keep our chest down, we want to lift the hands off the floor, but keep the elbows down. The idea here is to drive external rotation at the glenohumeral joint, lifting the hands as much as you can. When you get to the top of your movement, wherever that is, pause there for a moment and then slowly lower. If you find that you're really not getting any movement here, if the hands won't lift off the floor, again, place a bolster or a series of blankets underneath the abdomen and build the floor up a little bit. Okay? We do that again. Second lift. Palms are facing down for these first 3. One more of these. And then we're going to keep the same action, but we're just going to turn the palms so that our thumbs are pointing upwards. And essentially that's supinating the forearms, and it'll change the way that the muscles engage in the shoulder girdle as well. So turn the hands, keep the thumbs pointing up, and then repeat. Lift as high as you can. At the top, pause to see if you can maybe try and get a little bit more of a lift. Lower for a tap, and repeat. Tap down, one more lift, keeping the thumbs up. And then sit the hands down. Again, keeping the elbows at about 90 degrees. Now turn the palms so that the thumb is pointing down and the pinky finger is up. We're now pronating the forearm, and then again, that's going to change the engagement in the shoulder girdle as we do this. So try to keep the palms facing out, and then do this movement again. Lift the hands as much as you can. This one is usually the most challenging. So see if you can really drive a little bit more movement here. Keep the lift, hold at the top, and then slowly lower for a tap to repeat 2 more times. One more. Once you've done that third one, bring the elbows in close to your sides. Your elbows are now at 90 degrees again, but we have our arms down by our sides. For this one, we think about retraction of the scapulae. Okay, so drawing the shoulder blades together behind you. We think about that action and keeping that there. We think about drawing the elbows into our sides, and then we think about hovering the hands off the floor. Holding this position, we then try to keep the elbows floating in space and lift the hands a little bit more, okay? Or as much as you can. And then do a little tap down and repeat. Lift on up, keep the elbows tucked into the sides, keep the elbows at 90 degrees. Tap down, one more. Tap down, turn the palms forward now, so we're working on our supination again. Thumbs up, repeat, lift as high as you can. Pause at the top for a moment, tap down, lift up, pause at the top for a moment, tap down, one more. And then tap down, and then of course we turn the palms away, pronation of the forearms, pinky fingers up to the sky, and repeat. Keep the elbows tucked into your sides, they will want to run away. Try to avoid that. Lift the hands up as much as you can. Tap down, two more, lift, pause at the top. Tap down, one more. After that last one, take a moment, take a breather. Chances are you feel some of those, excuse me, some of those rotator cuff muscles in the shoulder girdle here doing some solid work. While you take a few moments here, just to highlight the importance of the rotator cuff muscles, not only do they have their own actions that they contribute to, but in every movement of our shoulder girdle, our rotator cuff muscles are attempting to keep the humeral head, the head of our arm bone, of our long arm bone, in an advantageous position on the glenoid fossa, which is the part where the humerus meets the shoulder blade, the scapula. And so it's really helpful, really beneficial to work on these muscles and optimize their function, and that's one of the things that this particular practice does. Okay, so now that you've had a breath, we are going to do one more round of that, but we're going to add a little bit of load. Now if you have foam blocks, you're very lucky. If you have cork or wooden blocks, then well done. I'll congratulate you to begin with. If you have books, maybe pick some light books. But we're going to do it again. So come back to your starting position and have your elbows back at 90 degrees of flexion. Now in your hands, take the blocks or the books. Make sure you've got a nice solid grip on them and that your palm is facing down while you're gripping them. And then we start again. So lift them up as much as possible, as high as possible. Pause at the top for a moment before lowering to tap the floor. Lift them up. Pause at the top. Tap down. One more for our three. Once you tap down, turn the blocks so that your thumb would be facing up if it wasn't gripping the block. Keep that supination of the forearm and lift. Two more. Last one, see if you can get a little bit more height. Once you tap down on this one, we pronate the forearms. So now the pinky is the one pointing up. Keep that pronation and lift. Tap down and 2 more. Tap down and 1 more. See if you can get a little bit more height on this one. Tap down, keep the block with you as you bring your elbows down to your sides. Draw the shoulder blades together behind you in retraction of the scapular-costal joint. Squeeze the elbows in, elbows at 90 degrees. Then we lift. We've got 3 of these. The palm is facing down. Tap and lift. Tap and lift for our last one. Tap, turn your forearms into supination so that the thumb is pointing up, and 3. Tap down 2 more. Tap down 1 more. Try to keep the elbows at 90 degrees. Tap down, turn your forearms into pronation so that the pinkies are facing up. Bring the elbows into the sides. Squeeze the shoulder blades together behind you for our last 3. Lift as high as you can. A little tap. 2 more. A little tap. 1 more so you can get a little bit more height. And set that down. Take a moment to breathe, rest, pause. Those can be quite demanding of some of our rotator cuff muscles, especially those external rotators. Okay. Take a few deep breaths there. And when you are ready, come on up to a comfortable seated position. We're now going to work on our scapular-costal movements, our cardinal scapular-costal movements, being elevation, retraction, depression, and protraction. And I often find it's helpful to progress this from a seated position before we load it up and before we alter the angle of flexion at the shoulder. So just to begin with, be seated. Maybe you're seated on a block or a bolster or something. Your feet don't have to be underneath you. Have your arms by your side and work on those cardinal movements with your hands, your arms just at rest by your side. So elevation, try to draw the shoulder girdle superiorly towards the head. And then draw them back behind you in retraction. And then draw them all the way down as much as you can in depression. Protraction comes forward for the scapular-costal joint. And then we come back to elevation. Now, you might also find it helpful or beneficial if you have a pole or a post or the corner of a wall. You may find it beneficial to be up against that so that you can determine if your spine is moving or not. So if you come up against the corner of the wall or a pole, align it with your spine, and then from there you'll be able to determine, especially in movements like retraction, if your spine is moving or if it's the shoulder girdle. And we want it to be the shoulder girdle in this particular case because we're trying to isolate the movers of the scapular-costal joint. So go ahead and do that 2 more times, trying to piece together those ranges of motion through a circular action. Elevation, retraction, depression, protraction. When you get back to a position of elevation, reverse. Come through protraction, depression, retraction, and elevation. 2 more of those. This is a really good way to get most people to connect with the movement of the scapulae, the movement of the shoulder girdle this way, before then changing the position. After your third one, we are then going to bring in about 90 degrees of flexion for the shoulder. So once you're here, have your hands out in front of you, repeat the same action. So elevation, retraction, depression, protraction. Create a circular movement by tying together all of those cardinal movements of the scapulocostal joint. Try to keep it nice and slow and try to get as much range of those actions as you can. When you've done your third, switch directions. Come through protraction first, then depression, then retraction, then elevation. 2 more of those. One more. Okay. Once you've done those, we're going to now come to an all fours position. Now this is where a lot of the time people lose the connection with the movement of the shoulder girdle and instead start to move the spine a lot more. There are different things you can do to prevent that. If you have like a dowel or something, you can align that with your spine again and try to use that as some internal feedback. You could also sort of keep an eye on the alignment between your forehead, your navel, and your pelvis, because what will happen is if that arrangement changes, okay, if that relationship changes, then it signals that the spine is moving instead of the scapulocostal joint, or perhaps in conjunction with them. So come to all fours, try to position your shoulders relatively over the wrists, and then we try to keep the spine still. And what I mean by still is relative to itself, it doesn't move. However, what's going to happen is we are going to find movement at the hip. So it's going to feel like my spine is sort of moving a little bit because my torso is going to come closer to the floor in certain movements. That movement is actually occurring at the hips because my spine is still. I'm trying to keep it still relative to itself. All right, without any more talking, elevation of the scapulocostal joint, and then retraction, drawing the shoulder blades together behind you, depression, and protraction. 2 more of those. Tie the actions together in a circular fashion. Try to keep them slow and try to explore as much range as you can here. 1 more in this direction. When you come back to that position of elevation, we reverse. Protraction first, depression second, retraction third, and elevation last. 2 more of those. Really try to extract as much movement out of these efforts as you can. Try to keep it slow and controlled. If you notice that there's a portion of your range that feels really choppy or uncontrolled, try to slow down through that range. Once you've done those 3 in reverse, Take a moment off the wrists, give the wrists a little bit of a shake, maybe a little bit of a roll. And then what we're going to do is we're going to change the relationship again before we then add one more set of load. So now we're going to come into further shoulder flexion by coming up into our down dog. This one is often one of the hardest positions to find those cardinal movements of the scapulae in. So just give it a go. Try to keep the arms straight. Start with elevation. Try again to keep the spine still throughout this work. So elevation, retraction, depression, and protraction. Try to tie the movements together in a circular fashion and try to keep it nice and slow. We've got 3 in that first direction. And then 3 in reverse. Protraction, depression, retraction, elevation. One more. Okay. After those, take a moment again, shake out the wrists, roll out the wrists. If your wrists didn't feel ready for this, by the way, it's a sign that maybe we could have done some wrist prep to start with. Being in this group, I think we all now have some wrist prep tools, so you can employ them. And then what we're going to do is we're going to add more load, but regress the position. So we're coming back now to 90 degrees of flexion at the shoulder, and we're going to add some more load here. The way that we do that is either by hovering the knees off the floor a little bit or coming up into our plank. Okay, so give it a go. Try as many as you can. We'll try and do 3 in each direction. Come up into your elevation, retraction, depression, protraction. Keep going. 2 more of those. Trying to keep the spine still relative to itself. Then when you get back to elevation after those 3, switch, protraction, depression, retraction, elevation. 2 more of those. Once you've done those 2, take a moment again, give the wrists a moment, a little bit of a movement. Now, when doing this work, the other really beneficial piece that you could add on to it is if you have a hanging space, doing those scapulocostatal movements hanging is sort of like an additional piece that makes the actions or makes the efforts even more holistic. So when we're working in respect to gravity, like I'm pushing gravity away, which is mostly what we're doing here on the mat, we get a certain amount of engagement and we get a certain type of engagement of the muscles. When we are hanging, we get a different effort and a different engagement. And that type of pulling work is often something that we miss. So if you do have the opportunity to hang, if you have a hanging space, then I would suggest after this practice, jump up there, hang for a moment, and then try to get those scapular costal movements whilst you're hanging, okay? and that'll be sort of an additional resilience piece. Now, what we're also going to do here, because we sort of want to integrate this into a bit of an action that you would encounter in a regular class, is we're going to come up to our downward facing dog, and we're just going to work on this transition between down dog and our plank. So as you come forward, making sure that the shoulder girdle has a range of different efforts so that we find ourselves somewhere in the middle of all of those positions that we just explored. And then come on back to down dog, controlling the spaces in between these positions, so controlling the transition. After 3 of these, we're then just going to add a little bit more load by, in downward facing dog, hover one hand off the floor and come forward to your plank as much as you can. And that really is going to demand a lot of work from all of the musculature that we just worked on. So do 3 of these. Just coming forward and sending yourself back. Last one. Again, it's a nice way to integrate all of that work that we just did. Switch sides. Come on forward. As you come on forward, especially keep in mind that you want to avoid dropping into that position of scapulocostal retraction. You want to try and control the position of the shoulder blade. Go nice and slow for your last one. And then set yourself down. You may feel inspired and ready to continue on with things like a vinyasa flow or something right about now. So if you do feel inspired to do that, please go ahead. Otherwise, if you have the opportunity to do some hanging work, then I would highly recommend that to really tie this work together in an even more holistic way. And I hope that your shoulders start to feel more supported, more stable, and that you can start to feel a little bit more control as you're moving your body weight around on your hands, on your forearms, and those types of efforts that you're producing there. Thank you so much for joining me here in this movement practice, and I look forward to seeing you again in the near future.